Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ethicast, coming to you live from the 14th Annual Global Ethics Summit. Hi, everyone. It's your host, Bill Coffin, coming back to you again live in the mid-afternoon break at Day 2 of the Global Ethics Summit here live in Atlanta, Georgia. It's been a fantastic day so far, and I'm going to recap for you some of the incredible content we've seen over the course of the day. It's just been a riot of incredible sessions, keynotes, and other discussions, and I'm going to try to break it down for you very briefly before we get into the rest of the content for the remainder of the day. So we began with a terrific Ethicast live session in which I had the opportunity to speak with Ethisphere leadership, Erica Salmon-Byrne, Andrew Neblett, and Leslie Benton about the ethics economy, what it is, what it means, and most importantly, what the ethics and compliance community can do to take advantage of it to strengthen their programs. We had a fantastic program with fantastic discussion, which we talked about a couple of really important things, mainly about how the ethics economy is really what we consider to be the next stage in stakeholder capitalism. It's that point in which all the highest values of ethics and compliance are intrinsically linked to business strategy and business outcomes. And from that, we've been talking about how these are precepts that have always been here. They've been around for quite a long period of time, but now we're seeing them being increasingly mainstream, even by areas that have been traditionally a little wary of these things, especially in the investor community, as tying the ethics economy precepts to long-term value is table stakes for what determines a good investment, a sound investment at a strong company with a great culture. More we talked with about how data matters, especially in the ethics economy, and how you're going to have to use it in a way to quantify your program, to understand your risks, but also to contextualize where you can move the needle when it comes to ethics and compliance. Massively important thing we need to take care of. But as we mentioned, data is data. As I said, it requires context, and simply just opening up the treasure chest for a pile of data is not going to get your program where it needs to be. You need to understand what data are you looking for, what data do you need, and most importantly, how are you going to use that data to help understand, determine, and deliver a measurable outcome. From there, we talked about the increase in efficiency. And on that, we realized that efficiency is an investment in time and in resources. But it's especially interesting to note that it's an investment in time, but kind of an open-ended one. As Andrew Neblett, president of Ethisphere, had mentioned, this is not the sort of thing when you're chasing efficiency that you want to put a time limit on it necessarily and make a promise you can't live up to. It's great to want to say, in a year's time, we'll make this jump. In 2 years' time, we'll make that jump. The truth of the matter is that these timeframes are best left open-ended because the progress in there can be uneven and it can be uncertain. And you want to make sure you give yourself that room to make sure that the investment your organization makes in program efficiency is one that is truly long-term and is not going to be chasing short-term results in the name of a long-term gain. And from there, we had some great commentary from Leslie Benton, who talked about how supply chains and supply chain resiliency really require a fresh set of eyes. We keep talking about supply chains as a linear linkage between company and provider and customer, but really it's more like a web, she said, and that we need to look at it in that fashion. What was really important is how she said, when we look at things like the ethics economy and looking at the values of an organization, at the ethics it lives by, oftentimes, partners in the supply chain web, they may be of uneven size. They may be smaller than the biggest ones they work with, and they may feel that they don't have sufficient leverage to make their partners adopt the same kind of codes and same kind of standards that they would live up to. But she said something very compelling, which was, it's not a matter if you have leverage. It's a matter of how do you use the leverage that you have. And in that way, a smaller partner on supply chain web can have an asymmetrical impact on the ethics and compliance activities of everyone it does business with. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. And before I get into any more recaps from the day, I do want to point out that over the course of the morning and into this afternoon, there was a series of fantastic interviews conducted by my colleague, R.T. Maharaj, as she spoke with her colleagues at some of our partners at Morrison & Forster, Baker McKenzie, and Hush Blackwell. You can see all of those interviews once again if you go to our LinkedIn page. Everything we're doing here is streaming to LinkedIn Live, and there you can see those videos again on demand. Now, after that, there was a fantastic session on managers as pressure managers. And it was a really interesting conversation with Jeanne Lemker of Major Lindsay in Africa, as she led a discussion with Deborah Spanik of Clarios, Beth Simon of Unum, and Ryan Miller of Nobilis. And it really talked about how, in a inside counsel perspective, a lot of IC are handling a lot more managerial aspects than they ever expected, and I think it created an interesting perspective on management training and integrity training. The question was given up: can integrity be taught in the same way that leadership can be? And the answers on that were actually fairly interesting. The one notion was that you can teach leadership and you can teach leaders how to think with integrity, but it's perhaps best to give leaders the tools they need and then give them the time and the space they need to draw those conclusions on their own, so that their embrace of integrity is actually a true and authentic one. When you pressure people, one of the quotes that I love so much from this was, when you're short on time, you make difficult decisions, and sometimes you make bad ones. So I think that's a really good thing to look at. The other key takeaways from this session that I thought were particularly interesting was this note of embedding into leadership expectations and measuring with pulse surveys how often managers talk to their teams about ethics compliance topics. This notion of constant communication is a really important one. And we saw some very interesting thoughts on how do companies codify this, how do they operationalize it, how do they make sure that the conversation between managers and their teams on the matters that really have great importance to an ethics compliance program, how do they ensure that these are not just one-off conversations, that these are recurring conversations, and that in so doing, they become part of the foundational culture of the organization? Promotion criteria was also pointed out as a place to inject this language with real importance, especially with managers. And then also there was some great conversation about how does an organization train its next generation of leaders so that they can see that working with compliance and ethics is a positive interaction. And it's something that's really geared towards finding a way to celebrate when people excel and when people embody the highest values of our organization, not to look at it as purely an exercise in punitive retribution. So from there, we had a fantastic block of breakout sessions. I was not able to attend them all, and in fact, no one can. That's kind of the thing with breakout sessions. So I will remind everybody out there that if you are a registrant of this summit, that have no fear. If there's something that you missed, if there's a session you wanted to go to but you couldn't, there are 2 breakout sessions at the same time, you couldn't get to them both, not a problem. All of this content will be available to you on demand after the summit ends, and you can watch them repeatedly, not a problem. So if you miss something, don't worry, we've got you covered. But we had a number of sessions that were really quite interesting. We had equipping the board to lead on ethics and compliance. We had driving your program forward with operationalizing compliance data, developing ethical leadership at the intersection of DE&I and artificial intelligence. That was virtual only. We had walk before you run, how to stand up or support a compliance program early in their journey. And then we had an Ethisphere Solutions with the Sphere. And in that, we had a terrific piece of testimonial from someone who's already using the Sphere. And they had said that the thing that they liked most about this new benchmarking service that Ethisphere provides is that it gives you the freedom to jump in and to look at data and analysis and resources wherever you need it, at your own pace, and that there's more utility in that than in, say, a more programmatic benchmarking consultation. So I thought that was really quite interesting. There were peer-to-peer roundtables, and there was also a pre-recorded program in action with Alcon on training. So we encourage you to take advantage of all of these in the on-demand section of the session after this is all done, and take a look at them. They're fantastic content. You won't want to miss it. Over lunch, we had a terrific keynote from the Second City. If you haven't seen the Second City before, it's a real treat. They're a delightful improv troupe. You may know them from all kinds of comedy venues, but they do terrific work with the ethics and compliance community on how to use humor as a storytelling method to communicate difficult ethics and compliance topics. And this session was particularly enjoyable to watch because they were addressing with the crowd how to address topics that people might have a natural resistance to. And are you using the appropriate method of communication for the message you want to send to people? And also, are you presenting a message in the right way with the right person, and talking about all the nuances about how to make a message land? And this is what brought us back to the power of storytelling. We all know it's easier to get something across when you're telling it in story form than when you're simply lecturing somebody. So what they did is they had a fantastic little live action workshop, an improv workshop, where they had people in the audience throw out different topics, different challenges, different venues, different settings. And from there, the improv troupe showed how they could pull them out in real time and improv sort of a solution. So with that, we had a couple pretty interesting and pretty funny segments on a conflicts of interest situation in the vein of Seinfeld. We had a historical scene about sharing too much information at work. And we had a particularly funny one about conflicts of interest and gift giving set in Middle Earth, which if you're a fan of Lord of the Rings, watching Gollum whine about his precious in a GTE context was pretty funny. It was pretty funny. So after that, we had another session on claws, carrots, and sticks, selecting the right tools to encourage ethical behavior. This is a panel discussion with Elizabeth Roper from Baker McKenzie, Adam Balfour from Bridgestone Americas, Richard Buckben from Manpower Group, and Jerry Krall from Brown Forman. And this was a really, really interesting episode, session, I would say. All this content today has been worthy of going back and watching on demand. This one I would particularly draw your attention to because there's so much in it. I'm not sure I have time to get into all the high points from this particular session, but it was a really, really good watch. And it started by talking about how do you incentivize ethical culture. Much more focused on how do you incentivize rather than de-incentivize. And one of the points that was raised was about the notion of bringing up indirect incentives, getting people to speak up and to take action with their managers and to speak on a regular basis. One of the takeaways they gave was an action where they simply gave a compliance tip of the month built into a newsletter. And those who saw this or who read it or who watched it or took action upon it, if their manager heard somebody referencing it, that manager would then be eligible for a reward program. And they really kind of gamified and incentivized the program to drive engagement and to make this a truly rewarding experience. And that actually produced some pretty interesting results. When we're talking about how to handle clawbacks, what was interesting is there are a variety of discussions on that. But one of the most cogent points that was raised was that oftentimes when we talk about clawback provisions, we look at them from a North American or even from a United States-based perspective, and that's great. However, a lot of organizations are global or multinational in their scope of operations. What was mentioned was that you may be driving an American-style clawback provision or clawback program, but the truth of the matter is that there are different expectations globally, especially in countries where there is a natural tendency for the legal system to be on the side of employees to begin with. So before you roll out such a program, you're going to need to get advice on whether or not your policies will be prohibitive outside of your home country. Beyond that, there was an interesting discussion on how to evolve your compliance function in terms of its collaboration with other teams. And one of the points that was raised, what was really quite interesting, was this notion of we need to challenge human resources more, particularly when it comes to dealing with compensation teams. What are we incentivizing people to do, and what are the consequences of that versus we're going to pay somebody by their fair market value? If you're incentivizing people to chase individual goals, then you can't actually drive a collaborative strategy. So this bringing compensation back to the notion of not so much are we paying people, but what are we incentivizing them to do was a really interesting sea change in thought. And it was put to the audience to kind of challenge them in a way of looking at how can we take the very notion of compensation and perhaps turn it on its ear so that it can actually deal more directly with the nature of our cultures and the goals of ethics and compliance. Fascinating stuff. Also, what was mentioned was we get back to the power of storytelling. And a point that was raised was how at certain companies, they will often bring in people from their employee resource groups to come in and to share their personal stories as a way to underscore a message of the ethics and compliance group. One example that was raised were when veterans from an ERG group for veterans came in and spoke to employees. They shared their stories. These were often, I believe these were families or Gold Star families, which means they were families who had family members. They had lost one or more family members in the line of service. And so these people had gotten out and they shared their personal experience as a way to talk about what does integrity really mean to them. And what was interesting is the quote here was, you will never find an e-learning course more impactful than that. ERG groups are really human. And how do you get people to do or what not to do? You have to engage them with the power of storytelling and engage with them on a human level. And with that, I will draw your attention back to a great keynote we had yesterday, where Julie Ann Crommett of Collective Moxie spoke about inclusivity and storytelling. And during that session, she had mentioned that when you talk with authenticity and with specificity, inversely, what happens is the more specific your story gets, the more universal it becomes, especially when you're talking about truly human things, about culture, about shared experience, about shared values. That specificity becomes universality. And we see this here in this example where the Veterans ERG came in and shared their very personal stories about what does integrity mean. Instantly went through the crowd like a lightning bolt, and the message got through, which I think was a really interesting case in point there. moving on from there, there was one last comment I'm going to drop, which I thought was really fascinating, which was about speak up culture and about what can companies do to really encourage speak up culture. And this comment, I should say, was speaking up is an opportunity to build trust or to destroy it. It matters when someone speaks up and tells their story because then they want some closure. And if we give them nothing, that's hard for employees to deal with. So I thought that was a fascinating takeaway in terms of speak up culture is not just a matter of capturing bad behavior or using it as information to address an issue. It is also a moment of need on behalf of the employees. Employees who speak up because they care, because they are loyal, because they're invested in creating a better culture. And when we don't give them the opportunity to make sure that their efforts have been seen and have been acknowledged and have been honored, that turns the whole purpose of speak up culture on its head. So a fascinating comment there, very, very, very provocative, very compelling. And that's the kind of content we can expect to see here at the Global Ethics Summit. Beyond that, there was another deep dive into the data points from the world's most ethical companies, and in which my colleague Neil Thurston provided some fantastic bullet points that was really getting all around the notion of third parties. So he had mentioned that 79% of honorees provide ethics and compliance training to third parties, which sounds pretty universal. And then only half of them monitor third parties that are high risk. And even below that, just above a third of them monitor all of their third parties. So obviously there's a lot of improvement to be done here. And as we went through more data points, we see that the world's most ethical companies data set is an extraordinarily rich piece of information that you can use to benchmark your program against others. I had the pleasure of speaking with World's Most Ethical Company honorees when producing the most recent edition of Ethisphere magazine, which will be available broadly next week. And as I spoke to honoree companies, they had mentioned again and again and again that the application process of the world's most ethical companies was a reward in and of itself, even if there was no recognition to chase. The truth of the matter is that the application, the ethics quotient, the application questionnaire, it has over 200 questions that people are asking, and the amount of data that will draw out of your own program, the amount of daylight it makes you shed upon your own program is itself enormously helpful and enormously rewarding. And then the ability to benchmark that against other companies is equally rewarding. So the data points Neil was offering here are just a taste of what kind of data dive one can do by being part of the world's most ethical companies process. And I thought that was really quite compelling and speaks quite deeply to the power of data and the power of benchmarking as critical tools to help drive your ethics and compliance program forward to even greater heights. Beyond that, we had one more session on avoiding ESG potholes, the CLO view on aligning with the board, delivering on commitments, and evolving governance. And this was another powerhouse board that had some really interesting things to say about ESG. And this is from the chief legal officer standpoint in terms of what does ESG mean for the organization? How can they actually push it through the organization, and what unique role can they play on it? And it was interesting. I do a lot of work with the ESG. We all do here at Ethisphere. I have myself written ESG reports in previous lives. And it was really, really interesting hearing this view from top legal officers on what an ESG program is, what it can do, and what the reporting should really look like. And I think one of the great questions that was brought up by the panel moderator, Erica Salmon Byrne, was how do companies address the proliferation of initiatives that come with ESG, and especially how do you approach the small G in ESG? And there were a ton of great answers on this, but one that I thought was really quite interesting was also rather simple, which is you need to think about what causes are going to be in your ESG program very, very carefully. You have to ask yourself, why are we talking about this? Or do we have any more voice on this topic than anyone else? That's a pretty interesting way to look at it. You also mentioned there's a great quote, which was, you need to find a way forward that is honest, relevant, credible to your industry, and shows a way forward. If you show that you are headed in the right direction and that you have a plan, then that is a great thing. And followed up on that was another great comment I heard, which was about ESG reporting, which was, if you can't tell what company it is from the ESG report alone, then it's not a real ESG report. How do you make it about your business instead of doing it just because you have to? So some fantastic daylight on this particular topic. ESG, as we know, is a topic of incredible importance to the ethics and compliance community. A lot of organizations have invested a great deal of time and energy into it, but there's still areas to improve. There's still areas to kind of codify what ESG means for everybody, even when we acknowledge the fact that At every company, ESG is different. So a fantastically nuanced conversation, and I'm glad I was able to witness it. So from here, we're going to be moving on to some more breakout sessions. There's a new dawn in third-party due diligence, maximizing time and attention of the board, leadership, and other stakeholders to showcase your program. The blurring lines of training and communication, using the best of both approaches to build employee competency. Helping managers get ethics compliance right in a world of increasingly varied employee expectations. Peer-to-peer roundtable, getting greater value from the investigations process. Ethisphere solution session featuring culture measurement. Developing ethical leadership at the intersection of DE&I and AI. That's virtual only. And these are all in the breakout session rooms upstairs here at the Atlanta Grand Hyatt. So that is the recap from today. As you can tell, it's been a massive amount of content, a huge amount of information. I'm going to let everybody go now so you can jump to your next session. But I encourage you to tune in for more content later on today after our next break. And until then, I'm Bill Coffin. Thanks for joining us here on the Ethicast. We'll see you again soon.